It's a statistical reality that every living white person has ancestors who were enslaved, but a great deal of white slavery was not done by fellow Europeans. This is the town of Baltimore in County Cork, Ireland. The tranquility of its rocky shoreline was shattered on the night of June 20th, 1631. That evening at precisely 2 o'clock in the morning, Islamic pirates led by a commander named Morat the Younger arrived banging war drums and screaming in Arabic. They arrived on 2 large raiding vessels flying crescent moon flags, one 300-ton flagship equipped with 200 men and 24 pieces of ordnance, including 12 cannons on each side, and a smaller, more maneuverable 100-ton ship with 6 iron guns on each side. It came as a shock to the Irish villagers, who were mostly fishermen. According to a book called The Stolen Village, quote, "None of these untraveled fisher folk would ever have seen anything like the Turkish warriors with their flashing scimitars, their swirling, flowing robes with distinctive cowls, the torchlight glistening on the sweat of bare arms, which they contemptuously left unprotected by armor. Storm them, my brave ones," some of the Janissaries would have been yelling, while others responded with shouts of Allah, Allah. These pirates were Janissaries, and they were raised from a young age to become fearsome monk-like fighters for the Ottoman Empire. Their story offers a good look into the proliferation of slavery. The forced levy of Christians to become Janissaries is called the Devshir Meh system, and it involved the kidnapping of hundreds of thousands of Christian boys over the 300 years that it was in place. The Janissaries had spent weeks sailing to Baltimore from Algiers, 1,200 miles away, preparing silently for precisely this moment. And when that moment arrived, the Janissaries were prepared. The villagers were not. Outnumbered 10-1, the citizens of Baltimore never stood a chance. Neither did the British Navy, which was responsible for patrolling the coast and protecting villages like Baltimore from attack. The British knew through good intelligence gathering in Algiers that the Janissaries were planning an attack, but expected it to happen at a much larger and wealthier town called Kinsale, 50 miles away. But Irish ingenuity claimed the day. Resourceful villagers gathered nearby, collected firearms and rum, and started making as much noise as possible. This convinced the pirates that an English army was marching on them, and they retreated from Baltimore, limiting themselves to around 100 slaves. The raid on Baltimore is unique because of where it happened, but such raids into Europe were fairly common. In 1627, for example, corsairs took 5 ships in a raid on remote Heimaey Island in Iceland. With total ferocity, they killed and maimed, they raped the women and girls, dismembered infants, desecrated churches, and slaughtered a priest at prayer. In that particular raid on Iceland, the corsairs kidnapped half the island's population. They murdered 1 in 12 villagers, including several priests. All in all, they returned to Algiers with roughly 400 slaves taken from the coast of Iceland. And along the way, they would seize church bells and attach them to the masts of their ships as trophies. They destroyed crucifixes and mocked Christians by destroying the Eucharist at every opportunity. According to the book The Forgotten Slave Trade, historian Simon Webb described this shocking contemporaneous account. Quote, "They began to set fire to the houses. There was a woman there, could not walk, whom they had captured easily. Her they threw on the fire, along with her 2-year-old baby. When she and the poor child screamed and called to God for help, the wicked Turks bellowed with laughter. They struck both child and mother with the sharp points of their spears, forcing them into the fire, and even stabbed fiercely at the poor burning bodies." In just 7 days, the historian Des Ecken writes, the typical medium-sized corsair ship usually seized 5 vessels, enslaved nearly 100 Englishmen, and stole roughly 60,000 pounds. Victims who weren't killed, in many cases, became galley slaves. Since the Roman era, galley slaves were considered the most effective way to keep the galleys moving, since they required coordinated rowing. If anyone took a break, they'd make the ship much less efficient. Webb notes that after a naval battle in 1571 between the Ottoman Empire and the Holy League, which included Spain and Venice, it became evident just how many Christians had been forced to row boats for the Ottomans and what horrific conditions these galley slaves had to endure. Following the battle, the Holy League discovered that more than 12,000 European Christians had been forced to row the galleys for the Ottomans. They were shackled 24 hours a day. They were not afforded the opportunity to lie down to sleep, not that there was any room to do so in any event. Webb writes that, quote, "A typical galley might have 25 oars on each side and perhaps 3 to 5 rowers for each oar. The slaves were shackled in place and were therefore physically unable to move from their designated positions. It was said in the 16th century that a galley crewed by slaves could be smelled from as far away as a mile. This was unlikely to be an exaggeration. Imagine, if you will, hundreds of men confined in a narrow space and compelled by nature to open their bladders and bowels where they were seated, day in and day out, for years at a time. There was no provision for washing. The only prospect of escape for the Ottoman galley slaves was if ships of a Christian nation defeated the Ottomans. A more dreadful fate is difficult to imagine. But not all slaves were forced to row the galleys. After returning to Algiers, some slaves, men, women, and children, were put up for the auction. Children as young as 12 years old were sold as concubines. In a normal auction, children younger than 7 could sell for over 100 pounds, roughly double the asking price for an attractive woman. Between 1500 and 1800 AD, the Ottomans and their North African corsairs, also called Barbary pirates, likely enslaved roughly 1.5 million people from Christian Europe. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, which was driven by pure profit, the Barbary raids on Europe were motivated by bloodlust and hatred. One historian described it as revenge, almost a jihad, for the expulsion of Muslims from Spain in 1492, for the centuries of crusading violence that had preceded them, and for the ongoing religious struggle between Christians and Muslims. By 1640, at least 3,000 British nationals were enslaved in Algiers alone. In just the 7-year stretch from 1609 to 1616, 466 English ships were, quote, boarded and the crews taken to North Africa as slaves. In April 1625, 3 ships from Cornwall and 1 sailing from Dartmouth in Devon were captured by corsairs and the crews taken. In August 1625, a raiding party landed at Mounts Bay in Cornwall. The villagers saw the ships at anchor and fled for safety to a local church, but this was not enough to save them. The slavers dragged 60 people out of the church, loaded them onto their rowing boats, and took them on board the waiting ships. They all ended up in the slave markets of North Africa. On the 12th of that month, the mayor of Plymouth wrote to the Privy Council in London. He pleaded for assistance from the Navy because in 10 days, 27 ships had been taken, and all of the men on board, over 200 of them, had been made slaves. Now, as bad as it was to be in British waters, it was worse in southern Europe. Muslim raids on the northern shore of the Mediterranean were almost annual events of terror and pillage. In 1544, in the Bay of Naples, Algerians took 6,000 captives. 6,000 more Italians were taken during the sack of Vieste in Calabria. In 1566, they took 4,000 slaves in Granada, Spain, in a single raid. They described it as reigning Christians in Algiers. The list goes on. In 1617, 1,200 men in Madeira. In 1636, another 700 in Calabria, Italy. Then 1,000 more in 1639, and 4,000 more in 1644. In 1683, the French military attempted to free some of the slaves being held in Algiers. The Algerians didn't take kindly to it. Quote, infuriated at their helplessness in the face of such an attack, the Algerians decided to vent their anger upon those Frenchmen who were at their mercy, including Jean Lavache. Algiers had, at the time, the most powerful cannon in the whole of the Mediterranean. It weighed 12 tons. The 23-foot-long gun had a range of 3 miles. The unfortunate French consul was pushed partly into the barrel, the cannon then being discharged with a load of shrapnel, blowing him to pieces. The Algerians found 22 other Frenchmen and tied them to the muzzles of other guns and killed them the same way.